Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Years of experience in the computer industry, including companies like IBM and Microsoft, which you might have heard of. He is now an investor and a rancher in Texas. And he's going to talk to us today a little bit about his history, his experience working at Microsoft, and what he looks for in investing and what companies can do to get better. So please, warm welcome for Mike Maples. And since I don't have a microphone, if you can't hear, please just make some motion in the back that you can't hear and I'll do something scream. So thank you very much for taking the time to come. And I'd like to start by going back a little bit. Where did you grow up? How did you get into, where did you go to college? What was your experience?
You want me to answer or you're going to tell me?
I want you to answer.
I grew up in a really small town in Oklahoma. It's small enough that people in Oklahoma don't know where it's at. I went to Oklahoma University, and so living in Austin, being a Sooner is an interesting experience, at least a few weeks of the year. I went to work for IBM, went to night school, got an MBA, moved around. My wife and I moved 25 times, partly in the military, partly as working for IBM. For an awful lucky set of circumstances, I ended up at Microsoft and was there when the company had 1,800 employees total. And I was there 8 years, and I left, and it was 35,000 employees. So I was there during a time where I was responsible for development and marketing, and my unit grew 87% compounded growth rate. So almost every year we were doubling, top and doubling. And when I first got there, I got a resume of everybody and learned everybody's names and their family and all their background. There were 250 developers. And when I left, there were 5,000. And needless to say, I didn't remember all their extension numbers and the kids' names and so forth. First company picnic I went to, there was one child. The last one I went to, there were probably 10,000 children. So, I hit a time when the average age was like 19 to 20. The average age of the senior people were all under 30. And so it was an interesting dynamic change from coming from IBM and going to Microsoft. Prior to that at IBM, I ended up being responsible for the PC software and the business practices of the PC. And that's how I got to know Microsoft, and then Bill and Steve Ballmer convinced me to replace Bill, who at the time was the head of applications, and Steve had systems, and then we reorganized like everybody does, and I ended up with development and marketing. So, I've heard most of what I have to say today. So it's really going to be important for you guys to ask me what you want to hear about. And I don't know that I have very much wisdom to share, but I don't put anything off limits. So anything that's more interesting to you in terms of, I retired in '95 from Microsoft, came out here and started raising deer and antelope. I do about 6 to 10 investments a year. I talk to probably 5 or 10 companies a week, and get involved with a very small number of them. So I can talk to you about raising money. I'm opinionated about everything. So that's the other thing you want to remember is the advice I'm giving you is probably worth about what you're paying for it. And then maybe just upset stomach from buy the pizza. But that's about it. So don't think you're learning any grand wisdom here. The only thing you're learning is a lot of experience. Okay.
Well, then, can you tell us about working with Bill Gates?
Yes. When I started Microsoft, I reported to Bill. I reported to Bill the whole time I was there. I was a member of what was called the Office of the President. I had development marketing, Ballmer had sales and product support, and Frank Gaudette had operations. And the three of us were the presidents. We met 2 hours a week, and that was our presidential duties. And otherwise, we kind of ran our own business. A lot of people ask about Bill. He is a extraordinary, interesting person. He can be very emotional and get very loud, but you never have the feeling that anything's personal. You never get into arguments with him that end on a personal note or that there's any memory about. He gets credit for a lot of things, like being smart technically, being a great business person, and so forth. He's certainly one of the smartest guys I've ever known, but I don't think that that's his strength. I think his strength is kind of synthesizing a lot of things that are happening and being right more times than not on what the future will be. He's not predicting it, but he's just trying to analyze leading indicators. He reads 5-10 books a week, talks to people all the time, has almost a near perfect photographic memory. There'd be times that he and I'd get in an argument, and he'd say, well, 6 months ago in your email you said such and such. And I said, no, I didn't say that. I'd go back and check the email, and he was always right. And he remembered what I said more than I remembered what I said. There's a huge age difference between us. I was the same age as his parents, so I had an interesting place at Microsoft because his parents and I were, my wife and I were kind of the same age and socialized together. And so I became kind of the parent at Microsoft for a while. When I got there, I was over 40, and I was one of the very small number of people. I started, and at IBM, I'd always worn a coat and tie, and so I showed up at Microsoft with my white shirt and my tie, and I was the only one there. I was dressed like that. And so I got all the developers together, and I gave them a presentation about my attitude about competition and my attitude about work and completion of work and responsibility and so on and so forth. And I had a slide. And the last bullet I had on the slide was dress code. And you get to see these 200 guys that just, here's this guy from IBM wearing a white shirt and tie and going to talk to me about dress code. And so I said, look, I've got a lot of white shirts. And you'd think I'd really be stupid if I threw them all away. So I'm going to make a deal with you. If you don't care what I wear, I'm not going to care what you wear. And in about 6 weeks, then they started a big pool of how long that'd last. And, the outside vote was 6 weeks. There were people that voted, 10 days, 5 days, or so forth. But I stayed pseudo that way for 6 or 9 months. But the funny thing is, some number of them came over to my side. So there was maybe 5% of the people would dress up occasionally. Bill gets trapped into some very funny situations. I can remember one time he was being honored at this IT thing in Dallas, and he had gotten some kind of award. And we used to always go to the airport kind of at the last minute. And he'd get up at 8 with the plane leaving at 8:30, and then get dressed. And if you overslept 5 minutes, you had 25 minutes to get dressed and get to the airport. And in this particular case, he got to the airport, and he realized when he got ready to get out of the car, they didn't have his shoes. So he ran and got on the plane, and they had phones in the planes. It was modern convenience. And he called his girlfriend's family who lived in Dallas and told him he needed a pair of shoes. And so we landed, taxied up to the thing, and her younger brother comes running in with this pair of brand new shoes. And so he puts on the shoes, exits, TV cameras, lots of people. The mayor of the city welcomes him and gives him a pair of boots. So he went around for 3 or 4 months, and it was my very favorite pair of shoes. He's an authentic person. You read a lot about his charity and the things that he contributes and the things. And I don't know if any of you had the chance to go listen to him when he spoke here at the university 2 months ago, 3 months ago. And he got asked a question about vaccinations. Well, it's a problem to start quizzing him on something he knows about, because he will tell you about every vaccination, when it was done, how many people died from it, which countries, before the vaccination, what was the rate of change over death rates or whatever happened because of it. And unless you're extremely prepared, you don't want to ask him a question kind of off the cuff or a political question, because he's all about data and facts. You can probably find it on YouTube, but he spoke at the Governor's Convention last year on education. And he spoke for a few minutes, and then the questions started popping up, and the governors would ask questions. He'd say, well, where are you from? I'm from Illinois. Well, let me tell you about your education system. You know, you got this many teachers, this many students, and this is your kind of budget, and this is the kind of textbooks you have, and here's what you need to do to think about, you know, changing the way you budget and the way you count for things and so forth. And then somebody else would ask a question, and he'd talk about Maryland, then he'd talk about Texas, then he'd talk about Utah. And he clearly knew more about the education system in every state than the governor of that state knew. And so it almost got to where people wouldn't ask him questions. But to some extent, that's the way he is. You know, he's just got this magnificent gift of a memory that he'll read through those charts and tables of statistics, and he's got them. Any other questions or thoughts from you?
Well, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about was, as I mentioned to you before, if you look him up on Quora, there's quite a few people who used to work for you that talked about, one, how impactful and inspirational it was to work for you, but also about the structure changes you brought to the product division when you started that, aligning things along product line as opposed to how they had been before, which I guess is just sort of one umbrella organization. And I wanted to have you talk some about why you did that at that particular time, and then in contrast to the announcement that Microsoft has made in the last few weeks about aligning along device lines, and you know, maybe what that says about, you know, changes in technology or changes in how you compete now as a technology company.
Well, I think the first thing I should say is there is not a perfect organization. So if you're searching for a perfect organization, you know, there's been multiple thousands of years and people have been looking for that. And so organizations reflect problems and people at a point in time. When I went to Microsoft, it was very vertical. All developers reported to the same organization. All the marketing people reported to the same organization. And the concept of a vertical-oriented organization like that is that the important skill is your development skills, and you can be moved around from project to project because you're a good developer. And so I brought the concept of the important skill was your customer set and your product skills, or the function of your product. And that said I wanted to organize horizontally. I wanted to have business units that were development, test, marketing, every functional represented. That turned out to be a pretty effective organization for a young, growing organization. And so we were organized around products and product classes. When I left Microsoft in 95, there were 250 products in development. Every product in development had a full set of, it was a small company. I held them responsible for knowing their competition. The guy that ran Word for Microsoft, I not only asked him about Word or about WordPerfect, I wanted to know about Pete Peterson, who ran it. I want to know how many children he had. You know, how old were they? And so I really wanted people immersed in the customer set, the competition, and the product. There are several downsides of that. Well, the fuel to that is empowerment. You can't manage 250 projects from the top. You have to say, okay, you project manager, or manager of the project team, it's your job to build a product the customers want, to sell it effectively, and so forth. Which means huge amounts of empowerment into the organization away from senior management. That's easy to do at the stage that you guys are probably at. That gets harder to do when you have 50 employees or 60 employees or 80 employees, because the decisions that you make now are being made by a lot of other people down below you, and you'd like to be able to control their decisions or guide their decisions, when in fact, you probably ought to not be doing that. One of the downsides is you create a lot of competition between the units. You know, the Word guys talked about the Word customers, and the Excel guys talked about the Excel customers, and you didn't have a lot of guys talking about Office. So bringing a concept like Microsoft Office together says you take these guys that think they have customers and products that are somewhat different and tell them that you want them to have more common user interface, more common file formats, more exchange of data between the programs and so forth. I'd say that probably got to be an extreme about 2005, and the current organization is a reflection of trying to change that, trying to say that you're not an Office person, or you're not a Windows Phone person, or you're not an Xbox person or developer, but you're a Microsoft developer, and you need to make decisions and trade-off that are good for a lot of parts of the organization. I think that organization probably has about a 3 or 4 or 5 year life. I think there'll be some good lessons learned for the employees, but I think that ultimately a business succeeds or fails by understanding more about its products and its customers than it does about always making a trade-off for the good of the whole. There are a lot of times that the trade-offs for the good of the whole make the whole not very effective, and that's the disease that most every big company gets. You can't get anything done because you have to listen to everybody about what you're trying to get done. So I personally wouldn't have done that. I would have chosen to do it a different way. But I don't think it's bad. I don't think it represents the beginning or the end of anything. I think it's a point in time when you need to change the way it is, and it's kind of like the rabbit. Alice, you don't know where you're going. Any path will do. Okay, you guys got to talk some.
I was going to say.
Because
you mentioned competition. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead. No. No, you're going. You're going.
Got it. Sorry. You mentioned competition and kind of keeping an eye on the competition. How applicable do you think that is? The common wisdom in kind of startup world these days seems to be forget about your competition, focus just on your product. And you hear a lot of focusing on your competitions like driving, looking in the rearview mirror. Any thoughts on?
Well, I think that's a question of your definition of competition. I'd say the competition for a word processor is a pencil. And you better know what people are doing with pencils if you're going to try to solve their problem with a word processor. So I think you don't ever want to be so smart, to feel that you're so smart that you've got an answer that's unique or different or so much better than what the people are out there doing or what other companies are doing. I think that you want to be quick to adopt the good ideas and quick to recognize that there's always an alternative to what you have. Now, if you don't care about what your competition is doing, then you have nothing to learn from them. And that's a pretty broad fallacy, I would think, because they got some smart guys too. And if you're not willing to steal their best ideas, then your product will be behind. Let me just add one thing. At one time, and I'd say Microsoft may be still this way, but we were fast enough followers that I'd go to a business show and see a new Word perfect feature that they were pre-announcing. They were going to deliver in 6 months. I'd go back and get it put in Word and ship it 3 months before they did. So you want to be careful because your competition's watching you too, and your very best ideas will be adopted by your best competition. So you can take that however. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the organization of Microsoft and how you had originally a bunch of different products that were responsible for their own customers, and then you tried to switch it to where you had everybody under an umbrella. How would you rather have gone about that process? I mean, you can argue that you kind of had to bring everything under Office for the sake of that product, but how do you do that in a way that doesn't lose touch with the customers like Microsoft did?
Well, the Office was the right thing to do, and it was right, I think, to get everybody to have the same terms and conditions and to figure out of the revenue of a product Office how much was contributed by PowerPoint, for example, and give people their credit. It's a different question when you say, if I'm responsible for the Xbox and I want to get Windows in the office to change because it's good for me, how much power should I have in setting their specifications versus them deciding from their customer set how important that is? And I think that's what Steve's trying to do. I think he's trying to say that too many times the team that did Windows would say, I understand you'd like me to do this, but I'm too busy doing what I think is important. And by doing that, Windows didn't work very well with Windows Phone, or Windows didn't work very well with SQL Server, or whatever. And so that's the problem he's trying to solve. The Office was a baby version of that. You know, getting PowerPoint and Project to work together was a baby concept compared to get all of the broad Microsoft product lines supporting each other. You know, just take as an example of a database. If you're writing a mail program, you have a database of contacts, you have a database of other things, and then you have a database that does accounting records like SQL Server or something like that. Is it more efficient to pound all those into one database that serves broadly, or is it more efficient to have 4 or 5 different databases? And in the long term, where does that end in terms of having 5 different databases that get diverting with 5 development teams, all getting ultimately to adding each other's features to their product because somebody's asking for it? You can take that example to either extreme, that we ought to have one database and it ought to be heavy enough to do the big lifting and ought to be light enough that you can put it on a phone. And there are lots of combinations thereof. But like I said, there's not a perfect answer to this question. At least I am not smart enough to find it. Yes, sir.
I'd like to hear you talk about how you've applied the lessons that you've learned in the software business to your ranching business.
Well, I think probably the number one lesson is you have a lot to learn. And when you start raising deer and you decide that you're going to get rid of the predators, you know, what does that do to the deer herd? It probably doesn't make them any more friendly, and it probably gets a lot of older deer and less healthy deer alive. And so once you start disturbing systems, you have to think about what are the longer term consequences to that disturbing of the system. I think that probably a reasonable percentage of the problems we're having with our government's effectiveness is they don't think very much about the consequences of the things that they do. And so there's always a whole long list of unintended consequences that cause a lot of people to be very short term. If it doesn't matter, then short term. But you know, reading, learning, observing, that's all what you do when you watch your customer when you're trying to learn something about the product.
Thanks.
I'm just going to jump to this one. What do you look for in companies that you're interested in investing in? And what?
Let me say my process so that you understand.
Yes.
I take 3 days a month, and I'll talk to anybody that wants to talk for an hour. So if somebody wants to call me or send me an email, I'll tell you what days that I have a half an hour, 45 minutes available. I have an hourglass. I turn it over when you come, and when it runs out, then you get to leave. And you can ask me anything you want. You know, I try to give you the best advice I can give you. Most people come and they hem-haw around for about 20 minutes, and then they say, would you invest money? And I'd say, well, what's some of your other problems besides money? And then they'll say, well, I need an advisor. And I'd say, well, what's some of your other problems besides advisors? Because you know, unless there's something that really clicks between us, this is the 1 hour.
Yeah.
And it's over. So what makes me more interested in some of the companies than others? One is, I think the idea is interesting. And there's certain things that I know something about. There's a lot of things I don't know things about. But ultimately, it boils down to, can I be of value? You know, I know people, have ideas, have some experience that can be helpful. And is it something, are you and what you're doing seem interesting? And so I'll end up with, you know, half a dozen companies a year that filter works for me. I don't invest to make a lot of money. If all of my investments, hit home runs, I wouldn't change my lifestyle. I'm fat, dumb, and happy where I'm at. If all of them go to zero, I'm not going to change my lifestyle. So I'm kind of in the perfect position that I can enjoy the ride, but it doesn't matter where it goes, particularly. So, hockey stick charts that show how much money you're going to make in the future aren't very impressive to me, primarily because I'm getting old enough and I'm going to die before most of it works out. So, to think about, here's a 15-year return on investment, I ain't going to be around to see that. And so I do it more for interest in the people and the product. I do it because it's kind of fun to be part of the game. You meet a lot of really interesting guys like Brian back there. They're a lot smarter, a lot better than you are. So that's kind of how I do it. So I may be a little unusual. I'm kind of driven by the concept that life dealt me an overly lucky hand. And it had little to do with how smart I was. It had more to do with being at the right place at the right time, and a lot of things happening that I didn't have any control or even any input to. And so, you kind of get a view that says maybe you owe back some of that. Maybe you can't just spend every day on Hawaii watching sunsets. And so you get involved with people that you might be able to help some.
Did you get started with investing? Did you know you wanted to do that when you left Microsoft?
No, I just retired. And I never lived in Austin, and so, kind of the criteria, whether it has a nice university, it's got a high-tech community, it's got a nice lifestyle, so bought a ranch, bought a house, and moved here. And then getting involved in either the state government or the university or in tech communities and so forth. Just came to fill my time.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you were at Microsoft, obviously, when it went through a huge growth as far as people underneath you. I mean, is there anything that you did managerially to kind of keep a rein on it? I mean, going from 250 people to thousands, I mean, was there anything to just kind of keep your authority over them? Or,
I took the opposite approach, and I said, it's okay with me if the organization is on the verge of being out of control. And that was kind of my organizational principle. How close can you get to being out of control? And so there's 2 or 3 things that senior management can do. They can allocate headcount. You get 10 developers, or you get 5 developers, you get 50 developers. When you start telling them what to develop is when you start running into problems, because you can't be smarter than everybody. And so empowerment is the key thing that makes growth allowable. Is empowering people to make, I would have projects, out of 250 projects that were in active development, I'd have products ship that I had never reviewed. And so, what risk am I taking? I'm risking that somebody, 22-year-old kid, is building Microsoft project. It's going to have Microsoft on the box, and there's going to be a bunch of customer reviews, and somebody's going to make up their mind about what they think about Microsoft project. And I trust him to do that without ever looking at what he's doing. Or she, as the case may be. So that allows a company to grow fast. It does create these if you're empowered to make every decision on your product, you don't have very much incentive to do for the good of the whole. Unless the good of the whole is just how much money you add to the pot. So there's a time for that, and there's a time for different systems. But I think when you're growing fast, hiring really smart people and really trusting them is the answer. Yes, sir.
Got a quick question. Something I noticed you said about Bill Gates, I've noticed about other big leaders, is they are more often right than wrong about where things are headed in the future. For just the average guy out there, where would you say go and read this or do this or be involved in this to see where things are headed for the future?
I'd say Bill was maybe 60% right, and I'd say most people are about 45% right.
What does he do, or what would you suggest that people do to get more exposure to where things are headed in the future? Things that you wouldn't find in the normal course of doing business.
What he would do is he would take about 2 weeks a year, and he'd go off and do think weeks. He'd ask all of his key people to give him books, give him ideas, write papers for him, or whatever. He'd go off for a week and read, study, and think, and he'd write a letter back to all the executives of Microsoft. And he says, you know, from what I read, this looks like some areas we want to concentrate on. This is some things we want to, you know, look into. And then we'd put that out, and somebody would work on it. And he could be very heavily influenced by one guy. You know, one guy convinced him to do the internet after visiting his university and seeing how the kids were using it. It was before the internet was really talked about very much. And so we went back and spent a lot of time. Now, what I do with the development is I'd pick like 5 or 10. The other way we controlled it, just in terms of control, is we asked each team to do a 3-year plan. And we wanted to know what were they going to do, what were they not going to do, who did they owe, who were they responsible to accept their customers. In other words, they were building charting technology that was going to be used by somebody else maybe. And that plan would summarize how many people they were going to have and need, and maybe if they had some ideas for more people. So the allocation of development resource was the major control that you had. If you didn't think you had the right person or going down the wrong path, you wouldn't give them as much resource. But that's they did monthly reports and all those kind of things. And you'd walk down the halls and talk to the people, all the things you would expect. But it's by and large, let them do what they think is right. The other bad thing about that, or the other thing about it, is there's a certain set of people and kind of people that do that really well, and there's a whole bunch of people that don't do that so well. And so, you know, the people who are successful at Microsoft today probably wouldn't be successful in that environment in those days. So, you know, the way people work and their expectation of an organization changes.
Yes.
One thing I haven't heard you talk about yet, but I do feel like it's really important to where I'm at right now in my business, is partnerships. Can I hear your thoughts about that, both from Microsoft and then also from the investing and startup side?
Are you talking about partnerships with some other vendor?
Partnerships and vendors, partnerships and teaming, coming in collaborations with projects.
But you're not talking about partnerships with the founders.
Yeah, in general, whatever you want to share about partnerships from your perspective, both from Microsoft and also from the startup.
The magic doesn't rub off. And if you're trying to get a partnership with IBM because you think they're important and they're classy, their success won't rub off on you. You want to make sure that every partnership you have is a fair balance to you as well as to your partner. What Microsoft would do if you go to talk to them about being a partner is ultimately they'd take advantage of you. And ultimately they'd get it more out of it than you would, and you would be willing to give away a lot of energy and resource because you would hope the magic will rub off. And that you would, you know, that somebody would read your Microsoft product and all of a sudden they run out and buy your stuff. There are many, many ways to make partnerships successful, but as the minority partner in most of the deals, you know, you're trying to deal with somebody that's a bigger partner or a more established partner. Remember, you have more to lose than they do if it doesn't work, and don't be willing to give away your assets unless you get something equally fair in return. You know, if there is an ecosystem, you know, I would say at the time I was at Microsoft, there was a huge Windows ecosystem, and a lot of partners did very well in that ecosystem. And I tried to be very clear about what we weren't going to do because of our partnership. and what you weren't going to get because of the partnership. But I found way too many entrepreneurs willing to give away the keys to the kingdom to claim that they were a partner. They don't see it work very much.
So what about the other part of that question? When you're looking at as an entrepreneur and you're trying to choose someone as a founding partner with you, especially in your investment experience, have you seen situations that have worked very well and maybe some that haven't?
Oh yeah, there's always examples of both. I think it's where it fails more often than not is if there are too many. You know, if you have 2 or 3, maybe it's okay. 6 or 8 probably gets to a point that it gets hard when one of them isn't skilled enough for the job and you have to replace one of your founding partners with somebody else. And that's inevitable, you know. The guys that start a company, you guys, probably aren't going to be the guys that run IBM or Microsoft. You know, your skill set's doing what you're doing now, not managing the U.S. Army. How many of you have advanced degrees? Okay. See, most of you guys already voted out of being an entrepreneur. Most entrepreneurs started when they were 17 or 18. You voted to go to college and then to get an advanced degree. So, you know, psychologically, you're much more interested in security and the future than most entrepreneurs. And I'm not being critical at all. I'm just saying that if you look at Bill Gates and you look at Larry Ellison and you look at Steve Jobs, they didn't waste time going to college. They didn't waste time getting advanced degrees. You know, they went out and built a company. That's not saying that having a PhD isn't helpful in building a company. It does say that you may be a little bit conservative on the risk you're willing to take. And that can be good too.
Two-part question. First is, in your last couple of years at Microsoft, what was the most awesome part of the culture and what was the part that you wish you could have changed more or that caused you the most friction?
Well, you know, every dimension of how you want to look at the people and measure people has a negative consequence as well as a positive consequence. And if you build a team that has a lot of great spirit and is really energetically committed to their product, you're building a not invented here syndrome, which means you have a harder time at looking at other things and bringing them into your product. So, you know, every good thing that you can define has a reverse. And I think probably the hardest thing to do is keep that in balance, because you can go, you know, if you're talking about technology leadership versus customer satisfaction, or you're talking about virtually any dimension of running a business, being successful, you have to have the tension of both. And so managing that's the hard part. When you're starting a company, it's all about, you know, really committed and really focused on getting done what you think has to be done, the minimum amount that you think has to be done to be successful. That's a different problem than when you got 1,000 employees or 2,000. In watching startups, I always felt that, you know, the guys that go from 0 to 50 employees have a willingness to jump through walls to get something done. Then the guys that go from 50 to 100, all of a sudden, you start having to think about processes, and you start having to think about how you're hiring and how do you keep the salaries equal and the stock allocations equal. And so you often have a major crisis and need a new set of leadership skills. Then when you go from 100 to 500, you're in a totally different kind of a company. You know, you're not building one-off products for every customer that walks up. You've got to have a really good accounting system. You've got to have somebody that really understands the laws on revenue recognition and a whole bunch of things that when you're starting a company, you can give nothing, you give no idea to. And so the kind of people that are CEOs of 500 people or 1,000 people companies are different kind of people than are CEOs of 3 startup guys. Probably in your career, you will find that the thing that you're good at starting companies, you don't like the other thing either. So you will probably be more than willing to trade in your title and your responsibility at your startup when it gets to be a big company and go do another one. And so, that's a lot of self-awareness. What are you good at? What are you trying to get accomplished?
I think I heard you say about your investments that you're very focused on paying things forward as far as rather than have a defined success criteria or the startups or the investments, success or failure. But can you maybe talk about maybe a couple of your favorite investments or the ones that made you most happy or most proud of?
Well, that's kind of like which of your children do you like the best? There are times when I like either one of them best. I think when you're old and kind of decrepit like I am, it's more about watching people grow than it is about being successful. But there is something about scorekeeping that's done with dollars and customers that makes you feel good too. So I'm not sure that I would say which is the best. There's some of them that had huge returns, 1,000 to 1 return kind of things. There's some of them that people have gone on and done really good things, maybe in tech companies or something else. And so the nice thing about my kind of role is it's going to happen without me. And so observing and being around is kind of neat. I might offend somebody if I pick the best.
No brave souls.
Okay.
All right, there we go. I have more.
I'll fall on the sword. It's cliche, but it's true that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. What are 1 or 2 opportunities, things that you may look back and say, I wish I would have done this or done this differently?
Passion is really important. And often you'll know how passionate you are about an idea. Good ideas without passion and execution never work. There's a million of them a day. And the 2 things that I see most companies not work out because of is they didn't believe with all their heart this is the most important thing in the world for them to be doing. And they didn't focus. They couldn't decide whether they wanted to do it in one ecosystem or another ecosystem. They wanted to do it in Linux, if they wanted to do it in Windows, or there was a new thing called a tablet, pivot over and do that. And anytime that a company goes around and pivots 4 or 5 times in a year, they haven't got enough focus. Because there comes a time when you got to say, I'm going to do X, and your success is going to be you did that or you didn't do that. Now that doesn't mean that you drive yourself out of business doing that. But if you don't ever give X a chance to work out, it never will. You'll have another good idea and you'll be off to another idea. And to some extent, the lack of focus kills more startups than anything else, I think. You have a good idea, and before you know it's a good idea, you're off on something else. I'm sure none of you guys have ever done that here.
So when you talk to companies, do you like them to have customers and revenue? At least, maybe not break even, maybe not making a profit, but that sort of traction, as they say.
I think that's somebody higher than me in the ecosystem that's going to make an investment. $50,000 or $100,000 is different than $500,000 in terms of where you are and how far you are along the line. The observation I'd make is that the cost of doing a startup is significantly lower now than it was 15 years ago. 15 years ago, you had to buy a Sun server and buy an expensive Oracle database and everything just to kind of get started. Now you go buy some time on Amazon, and you've got your own virtual machine, and you can do a lot for a little bit. The same is true with tools. There's a much better selection of user community support tools and so forth than buying really expensive things. It used to be thought that the most important thing to do is fill out your whole organization and hire good marketing people, good salespeople, and so forth. And I think people now realize that that's a staged kind of things. There's no reason that you can't start a company for $100,000, $200,000 and can't build a real company for $2 or $3 million. 10 years ago, that number was 15 to 20 million. And so you saw companies raising $2 and $3 million on an idea. And then the next round would be $6 million. Well, you go back and you look at those companies and you see what they did with the money, a third of it was total waste. Instead of buying a copy machine to make copies, they would buy the color one that had bins and had staplers and punched holes. And you know, it may not seem much difference to have a copier that costs $6,000 or one that costs $500 until you start adding up all the $1,000 chairs you bought and all the big screen monitors you bought and all the, you know, everybody had to have 2 of these things because that's what somebody else had. And so most of the companies that I saw, that I observed that raised a lot of money early on, wasted tons of it. Super Bowl ads, a lot of salesmen didn't even have products to sell. Now, fortunately, that phase failed, and you know the world got smarter. But now I think it's easier in a lot of ways to start a company. Yeah, we want to sacrifice, but you don't have to be able to convince somebody with a great sales pitch that you need 3 or 4 million. At least first go out of the box. I'll give you a couple of pieces of advice on funding. I'm not very well thought of by a lot of the venture capitalists because I think a lot of venture capitalists are kind of their business model is broken and doesn't work very well anymore. And so I recommend that people think really heavily about how can you get to revenue faster and start funding yourself some? How can you get by with less money? And how do you find some strategic partners that you can help bootstrap? And what is a strategic partner? A strategic partner is somebody that needs your solution worse than you need their money. And you know, if that's your partnership that you're looking for, then that's great. If you find that some national semiconductor needs an X and you have a way to get it to them, and they need it worse than you need the funds you're going to charge them. I would do things like selling my strategy and giving them a long-term contract for cash. Cash is your number one problem in the first 5 years of your business. Is how do you get enough cash to keep going? It's not the potential of the future. It's not, you know, a whole bunch of untapped opportunities. If you give away half your untapped opportunities to get enough cash to keep going, that's a wonderful trade. So, now, having said that, when the time comes you really need the venture capitalist, when the time for expansion and growth and leverage, they have the ability to do that. Now, you want to remember that they only care about 1 or 2 companies out of 1,000 that they really invest in. You know, some of the numbers are there's about 15,000 investments made a year in startups. Of those 15,000, you look over a 5-year period. Well, let's say 15,000. There's maybe 1,500 done by professional investors. So you've got a whole lot that's done by non-professional investors. You've got, of those companies that were started, in any one year there will be about 75 that are successful being defined as a $50 million or greater exit. And to a venture capital, that's not successful. That probably didn't pay back their investment. And there will be about 8 or 10 that are 250 million or more that sell themselves or merge or do something 250 more. So, you know, what odds are you starting out facing? 10 out of 15,000. So if you started this year, there will be, of the guys that started last year and the year before that and the year before that, there will be what the venture guys are looking for as the really successful exits. There'll maybe be 10 of them. And so, you know, there's a whole lot of investments they made that they just wrote off. It turns out that the success of companies follows kind of a power log curve that the best exit in any year is worth more than all of the other exits put together. The second best exit is worth more than 3rd through 15,000. And so, if you don't get in the top 10 investments as a venture guy, you're losing money. So you've got to be in the 10 best every year to pay out. They don't measure how many employees, how many jobs you created, or how many families are living off of the business. They measure the guys that are, they become worth $1 billion or $2 billion or $5 billion or $10 billion. And the odds of doing that are astronomical. The work says, the definition of an entrepreneur is one who has a short-term view of a no understanding of risk and a short-term view of success. Now, the reason I started that, I don't remember why I started for sure, but it turns out that your financial partners at the end of your life are probably a lot more important to you than your financial partners at the beginning of your life. Your second, third, and fourth round investments, when the investments are getting to be big numbers, the best of those guys help their companies 10 times more than the worst of those guys. And it's not the money, it's their contacts, their ability to help you, their ability to recruit for you, their ability to a lot of things. And so being very thoughtful about, let's say you're successful and you've got a 500-person company or a 300-person company and you're making $75 million a year, and you're going to try to drive that to $250 million a year, and then create some event to create some liquidity. The guy that helps you that last is very important selection. It's going to be much more important on selecting them on their ability to help you than it is on their having money for you. There are 800 registered venture funds. And so how many of them are participating in these top 10 every year? Most of them are going broke every year. And that's the reason they call it risk capital. The average return on venture over a long period of time is almost exactly the same as the stock market. There are a few deals that return a huge amount, but there are a whole lot of deals that return almost nothing. Okay, so now I've had my little speak about venture capitalists. Unfortunately, one of the members of my family chose that nefarious route.
How's he doing? So you said you have opinions. What about Kickstarter and other sort of crowdfunding platforms? It's relatively new.
I think it's a step forward in trying to broaden or take out the initial investment out of the hands of the quote-unquote professionals. I think it has a whole lot of risk. I've seen probably a dozen or so garage.coms and startup.coms and all these things, and most of them fail. And most of them fail for three reasons. One is they get overwhelmed by the service providers. The lawyers, the accountants, the financial guys come in and take over the meetings and everything else. I hope I'm not offending anybody about that. But what you guys really need is your ability to talk to other people who have got the same problem you have, not some lawyer very much of the time. There is a part of making it hard that helps refine the entrepreneur. I've seen some of these startup kind of places where they try to over-baby the entrepreneur. And most of them don't have very good results. There's some about struggle and trial and error and worrying at night about things that makes the entrepreneur better. And you'll appreciate that probably a lot more when it's past than you do when it's with you. But I think that the Capital Factory probably doesn't over help you, and it does provide a forum for you guys to talk to each other. And there are a few places that have been successful doing that, but I think that the outcome is still undetermined for sure. Take all the billion-dollar software companies you know, and how many of them were started that way. Oracle wasn't, Microsoft wasn't, Google wasn't, Facebook wasn't, Twitter wasn't. So if you want want to get in that rarefied space. Those guys think different than people that do this.
We have time for a couple more questions. So you can...
Before you run the bum off.
Any thoughts on AngelList? You talked a little bit about Kickstarter, but any thoughts about kind of the consolidation of angel investment?
The ones I have seen be successful are the ones that have a primary leader that is well known that supports them. You know, so if you get Bill Gates to join in your crowdfunding, for whatever reason, or other people are going to think that he knows more than they do. He may or may not. But I've seen a couple of them where, you know, the guy who started LinkedIn said, you know, I'm going to put $200,000 into this, and pretty soon they raised $700 million. And so, if I was going to do that, and at least of the ones I've seen be successful, is recruit almost like a lead investor, you know, a strategic partner or something that creates credibility with, because most of the people that are looking at your deal aren't going to do a very good job analyzing it. So what are they voting on? They're voting on an idea which they have no idea about, and they're voting on somebody else that, you know, the person they flocked with. If you look at angel investors, they generally flock. You know, there'll be investment groups and 5 friends get together, and so they travel in flocks. And they do that because they always believe that somebody else knows how to analyze the situation better than they do, or has more time to analyze the situation than they do. And so they feed off of each other in terms of, yeah, it sounds like a good idea, and I know this guy, and he's a great guy. And I think if you start to think about the crowd sourcing, you almost need to have a sponsor in part that part of the deal. Not an easy thing to do.
I gotta ask, did you ever see any of the, I guess now, infamous Bill Gates, Steve Jobs showdowns?
Yeah, I've seen a number of them.
Any notable ones?
Well, probably the most interesting one I ever saw was when Connie Chung interviewed Bill one time. And, you know, Bill's very friendly and very easy to work with. So, you know, with Steve and those guys, they had a few arguments with, you know. Connie Chung came and was going to do a special at Microsoft. Had people on campus for 3 weeks interviewing everybody. Was doing this, going to build this thing. And I went over to see Bill about a problem, or a project, a problem. And I was supposed to see him at 5, and things were way behind schedule. So I just sit down in the secretary's chair who had left and was sitting outside of his office. And Connie comes in, and they set up all these lights and everything. And the PR and her producers had agreed on some subject they wouldn't talk about. At the time, there was a lawsuit going on with Microsoft and a company called Stacker over a compression technology. And so Connie asked Bill some puffball questions, and then she says, well, you know, I talked to so-and-so who's the CEO of Stacker, and he says doing business with Bill Gates is like being in a knife fight. Well, Bill gets pretty emotional, and he says, well, what do you know about this case? And she said, well, you know, and she had no facts at all to support, you know, the situation, who was on what side or anything else. And so they start yelling at each other. And he said, you know, we're not supposed to do that. And so she's yelling at her producer, and he's yelling at the PR people, and pretty soon he jumps up and walks out. And so, you know, everybody's scurrying around, and about 30 minutes, everybody's really red-faced. About 30 minutes, everybody's gone in, so I go in, and I said, Bill, you know, I had some time, I was going to talk to you about this issue, and this probably isn't a real good time for you or me to be here. And he said, no, let's talk about it. He immediately just turned off completely all of his emotions and all of the energy that had been spent the last half hour in this big fight. And we just started talking about this problem. It's like it was the only problem he had to work on.
Another 2-part question. How do you make really tough decisions? I mean, like gut-wrenching decisions? Are you more of a analytical person, or do you go more with your gut and heart?
You're talking about me personally?
Both.
I think you want to do both. But the thing I would observe is the harder the decision, the more likely it doesn't matter what the answer is. You know, if the decision comes down to 49% versus 51%, which doesn't matter what you choose. If it's 80 versus 20, it's more obvious, and it matters more what you choose, the right answer. So basically what I would do if I had a really tough decision, I'd learn as much as I could about it, I'd listen to my heart a little bit, and then I'd say, it probably is not going to matter what I decide. There have been a lot of smart people who have told me this side, and a lot of smart people have told me that side, and they're in a tie. And all they just need is somebody to break the tie. They don't need somebody to tell them what the right answer is. And so, you know, I'd say go with what you feel is the right answer. You'll be, if it's really a tough decision, it'll either be real easy or it won't matter what the answer is.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to ask, at what point do you release a product perhaps? I guess I've been at some places where they release the product and it's partially done because they're just trying to get market, trying to get to the market first, and then they might gap and somebody else comes behind them with a product that actually works. So at what point do you release a product?
Well, the engineer's curse is they always are trying to be perfect. You know, all the guys that are in development, you can always make it better. More time, more energy. One of the phrases I used to use a lot was shipping as a feature too. And someday you have to ship the product and let the world vote on it. On any product, you've got three dimensions that you have to care about. One is the function, one is the quality, and one is the schedule. And it's the compromising of those things together that screw up products. So as a general rule, I'd say never ship if it doesn't work. So that's one that you can't fake. You might make some mistakes, but shipping a buggy product that you know is not going to work in order to gain some time is never going to work. You can make a trade-off between function and schedule. You can ship it later, make it better, or you can ship it earlier without all the function and have to live with the consequences. No good idea is solved with one release. So there are going to be more releases, there are going to be more follow-ons that you have a chance to deal with. So from that perspective, what you need to know for sure is what does the customer expect? What's the level of expectation that's acceptable? You know, when I started doing word processors, you know, the fact that it would even print was important, and a lot of them didn't. And now you got to have you got to have variable fonts, and you got to be able to do all kinds of things in your word processor. So back in the days when Word first came out, or when some of the products, they barely worked. It wasn't very much of a function of being polished, but that was okay because the customers didn't expect any more than that. The fact it worked at all was a big move up from the typewriter. And so the product that you'd ship today as a word processor has to be infinitely polished compared to the one we shipped in 1989, for example. Now that's a question of expectations. You don't ship a SQL Server today that crashes every other day. Back in those days, that's pretty normal. Building products that were much too big in much too quick a time with much too few people. So there's always a risk analysis with that. And I would tend to be much more tolerant of something that was either functionally or late over poor quality. Senior management, when you look at those three things, if you've got senior management, most of you probably don't have senior management yourself, but senior management can't really control all three of those. It's impossible for you as a developer to have somebody says, I want 0 defects on schedule with this set of function. There's been no analysis to say you can get that set of function done with 10,000 people in that time frame. And so you have to turn one of those decision factors over to the guy that's building it. And as soon as senior management starts saying, you got to have this function on this date, you're going to ship a bad product. You're going to ship a product that either has poor quality, that's the easiest one to hide before you ship, or you're going to ship one that's functionally inferior to what the list had on it, or it's going to be late. And you can almost take the size of the project and figure out which one it's going to be. You know, a big project at General Motors is going to be late. It's going to have a little bit of problems, but it's all, you know, internally developed, but it's always going to be late. And it probably will have 20% less function than they start off thinking it would have. But just the fact they have something is good enough. A project that a startup does is going to be generally functionally inferior. It's not going to have all the features and things you'd like to have. The concept of late hardly applies because nobody was expecting you to be there. Brian, what do you think?
Those are the 3 school legs. One of the things they always say is, you know, what you really want to do is want to delight your customers. And the easiest way to do that is give them more than what they were expecting. The way to do that is to make sure they don't expect much. You can manage that, you're in good shape.
You all may not know Brian. He's been through this a bunch of times. He's had a lot of successes, and if you have any technical questions, he can answer it.
Last one.
Just a little bit about your hiring philosophy. How have you hired people?
How do you hire people?
How have you hired people over the course of your career?
Well, I have a whole recruiting pitch for you if you want to hear it. But first thing to recognize is that every personnel decision is a very expensive decision. Every person you hire is $1 million decision or more. The second thing is you always want to try to improve the combined IQ of the group. So you're always looking for somebody that's a lot better than you are. People hate that idea a lot of times because they like to have people they can tell what to do and that are just journeymen and doing their bidding. But the fact is you really want somebody that's smarter than you are, because if you hire somebody not as smart as you are, the average IQ of the organization went down. If you hire somebody smarter than you, the average IQ of the organization went up. And so you want to drive that up. Now, it turns out that hiring people is like a lot of things. It's about testing the candidate. And too often in hiring, you say, well, where have you been? And, you know, what did you like? And so forth. I think a very rigorous review of the person is called for. They should know that they're going to be. If you put something on your resume, I'm going to test it. If you say you can write Excel macros, I'm going to have you write me one, and I'm going to have you speed it up, and then I'm going to have you debug it. If you say, you know, Joe Blow is my manager, I'm going to call Joe Blow and say, tell me about this guy. And Joe's going to tell me all these good things. Worked hard, really liked him, hate to see him go, good person, you know, got a good daughter, just a great guy. And I'll say, okay, if there's one thing you can prove about Joe, what would that be? Well, you know, he's a little slow sometimes at turning things in. And pretty soon we're in a discussion of all the 5% problem areas. And so I think that if you ever hire anybody that you haven't interviewed 5 or 6 times, you're making a mistake. You want to know how smart they are. You want to know if they're a team player. You want to know how honest they are. You want to know some successes they've had. You want to learn. You want to know how much did they learn from their failures. Most interviews for most people that you guys do are more about selling the guy than they are about evaluating the guy. And you're lucky because it's a small community, and reputation and who you hang out with and so forth is important, and that can be really good. But as you start growing and you go from 10 to 20 programmers and then to 50 programmers, your standards and your ability to find your friends start weakening very fast. It's a big decision. It's a business decision, and you ought to treat it as such. Hey, it's been great talking with you guys.
Thank you.